The Return of the Wild Man, written and narrated by Graham Leggett. Introduction. There was a time when man was a force of nature, untamed, sovereign, and free. Before the walls of civilization rose to shelter him, before comfort dulled his instincts, before submission crept into his soul, he was something else entirely. He was a beast among beasts, a predator who knew no master, a mind sharpened by the hunt and a body forged in suffering. He was the wild man. He did not ask permission from the world. He took from it what he needed and gave nothing but his will in return. He was not ruled by the ticking of clocks or the whispers of weak men. He moved with the sun, fought with the storm, and slept beneath the open sky, unafraid of its vastness. His existence was an unbroken war against stagnation, and through it he became something modernity can barely comprehend, a being of unrelenting power. The world has forgotten him, but he has never truly died. His spirit lingers in the unclaimed spaces, in the deep forests, in the towering mountains, in the violent surges of the sea. He is the heartbeat beneath the soil, the whisper in the fire, the hunger in a man's gut that tells him there is more to life than servitude. This book is a call to remembrance, a map to rediscover what was lost, a resurrection of the sovereign warrior, the ascetic predator, the primal philosopher. This is the doctrine of the wild man, the path back to what was once ours. For those who hear the call, let it be known, the age of the wild man has begun again. The wild man in prehistory, how strong were they? Before civilization softened the human body and dulled the mind, there existed men who could outrun antelope, wrestle apex predators, and endure suffering that modern humans cannot fathom. They were not mystical beings. They were the natural state of humanity before it was severed from hardship. These wild men of prehistory did not merely survive. They thrived in environments that would annihilate modern humans. Fossilized footprints in Australia suggest they sprinted at speeds of 37 kilometers an hour, or 23 miles per hour, comparable to Olympic gold medalists today. And this was in wet sand or clay without cleated running shoes and modern Mondo rubber tracks. Analysis of their skeletal remains have revealed that their bones were up to 20% denser than those of modern humans, comparable to or exceeding Olympic rowers and distance runners. This increased bone density suggests they could withstand higher impact forces, making them exceptionally suited for endurance, combat, and carrying heavy loads over long distances. The muscle attachment sites, grooves and indentations where tendons connected muscle to bone, indicate that their musculature was significantly larger than that of modern Homo sapiens. Studies on Neanderthal fossils show that their shoulders and arm muscles were far more developed, with humeral torsion angles suggesting powerful rotational strength, ideal for spear throwing and combat. Similarly, leg bone cross-sections suggest extreme lower body power, mirroring that of modern Olympic lifters and sprinters. Unlike the domesticated human, the wild man's cardiovascular system was conditioned for the long hunt. Persistence hunting, a practice where prey was chased to exhaustion, required them to cover dozens of miles in pursuit of their quarry. Their lung capacity and oxygen efficiency were unparalleled, allowing them to sustain these efforts without collapse. Their nervous systems were honed to react instantly. No reliance on technology, no soft comforts, only raw instinct guiding them. This was not a different species. This was the undiluted human form, a being capable of immense power, supreme endurance, and absolute resilience. A man unchained from the slow decay of civilization. The tribes of giants and berserkers, real lineages of the wild man. Cro-Magnons, Denisovans, Homo heidelbergensis, and Homo longi. There was a time when men were titans, not in legend, but in blood and bone. They walked the earth in the twilight of the Ice Age, carving their existence into the mountains, forests, and frozen wastes. Their legacy is buried in the strata of forgotten time, but their remnants, skeletal behemoths, tools shaped by monstrous hands, echoes of their might, and they remind us what we once were. Cro-Magnons, the undisputed champions of the Ice Age. Cro-Magnons were the direct ancestors of modern Europeans, yet they towered over their modern descendants. With brains larger than today's humans, their intelligence was matched only by their physical prowess. Their bones tell a story of immense muscularity, their tools evidence of precision and craftsmanship that rivaled early civilizations. They were artists and warriors, thinkers and hunters, men who shaped the land with their will alone. Denisovans, the ghosts of the highlands. These enigmatic giants left little behind but their genetic footprint. Taller and stronger than Homo sapiens, they thrived in the brutal heights of Siberia and Tibet. Their DNA still lingers in certain human populations, most notably among the Tibetan, Sherpa, and some Han Chinese peoples, granting them superior oxygen efficiency at high altitudes. This adaptation, inherited from the Denisovans, allows them to thrive in oxygen-depleted environments like the Himalayas, where most lowlanders would suffer from altitude sickness. The EPAS1 gene, a Denisovan legacy, regulates red blood cell production, preventing excessive thickening of the blood while maintaining optimal oxygen transport. This survival advantage continues to shape the physiology of these high-altitude populations, a lingering testament to the power of the ancient wild men, a remnant of the ancient survival strategy honed in the most hospitable landscapes. Their descendants still walk among us, though their full glory has long faded into the past. Homo heidelbergensis, the prototype of the warrior. These were the men who first wielded fire as a weapon, who hunted the great beasts of prehistory not with fear, but with the cunning of a predator. Their spears, found embedded in the ribs of extinct megafauna, tell of a species unafraid of battle, a breed of man who saw the mastodon and did not flee but fought. It is likely that they were the bridge between the primal and the conscious, the first men who truly understood power. Homo longi, the dragon man, possibly the last great colossus before the taming of mankind. With a skull built for war and a frame to match, his discovery rewrites what we know about human prehistory. His lineage may yet remain unknown, but the fragments we have suggest a being whose strength would humble the strongest men of today. His place in the hierarchy of wild men remains a mystery, but if he is the missing link, then he is proof that giants once roamed this earth. These were not mere primitives, they were apex beings, the pinnacle of human evolution before the great domestication. Their strength, intelligence, and resilience were the foundation upon which the wild man was forged, and their echoes remain in the bloodlines of the strongest men today. The science of supremacy. What made the wild man superior? The wild man was not simply stronger. He was built differently at every level. His nervous system, musculature, skeletal structure, and cognitive function were all adapted for a life of hardship, requiring a body and mind that could withstand, adapt, and conquer an unrelenting world. Modern humans, by contrast, have been insulated from the selection pressures that forged this supreme being. Nervous system adaptability, how hardship rewires the body at a genetic level. Modern science has begun to uncover what the wild man always knew. Stress and hardship refine the organism. The nervous system does not passively experience the world. It adapts to it, rewiring itself based off stimulus and response. This is seen in epigenetic modifications, where gene expressions change based on environmental challenges. When subjected to constant movement, combat, and environmental extremes, the wild man's nervous system was in a perpetual state of heightened adaptation. Neuroplasticity and reflex conditioning. The wild man's brain and motor neurons were constantly reinforced through his survival-based learning. His reaction times were faster than modern man's, honed through an existence where failure meant death. Pain tolerance and hormonal adaptation. Exposure to sustained physical hardship increased endorphin production and pain resistance, making injury far less debilitating than for modern humans. Increased testosterone levels further supported muscle retention, aggression, and resilience. Stress response and adaptation. Unlike today's population, which suffers from chronic artificial stressors, the wild man's stress response was targeted and functional. Adrenaline surges when needed, followed by full recovery. His autonomic nervous system was fine-tuned for instant aggression or total relaxation, with no lingering cortisol-based anxiety. The foundation of power: bone density, grip strength, and explosive speed. The wild man's skeletal structure was a fortress compared to modern Homo sapiens. Bone density in hunter-gatherers and early humans was 15 to 20% greater than today's humans, rivaling or exceeding that of modern weightlifters and competitive rowers. Thicker cortical bone layers and long bones meant their limbs were far less likely to fracture, even under extreme stress. Joint resilience and ligament density allowed for greater tendon elasticity, providing enhanced biomechanical efficiency. His grip strength was unprecedented, developed through constant climbing, tool-making, and combat. Studies on prehistoric hand bones reveal metacarpal robustness that suggests grip force is far beyond modern humans. Tool and weapon wear patterns showing consistent high-force manual labor that would rapidly fatigue today's hands. And comparisons to elite climbers and wrestlers whose grip endurance is a fraction of what the wild man's daily survival required. Speed and agility were equally crucial. Tibial cross-section analysis suggests prehistoric humans had leg power comparable to modern elite sprinters. Persistence hunting evidence shows that they were capable of maintaining speeds over long distances, running prey to exhaustion. Biomechanical reconstructions reveal optimized leverage for short burst acceleration, matching modern explosive athletes. The wild man's cognitive supremacy, strength paired with higher intelligence. The wild man was not a brute. He was highly intelligent, hyper-aware strategist. His brain-to-body ratio was often higher than modern humans, and his ability to process environmental data in real time made him an unparalleled survivalist. Pattern recognition. In the wild, recognizing weather shifts, animal tracks, and micro-expressions in combat determined survival. His situational awareness far exceeded modern humans. Hunting strategy and tactical intelligence. He was a master of ambushes, formations, and tool efficiency, using calculated deception and teamwork in battle and the hunt. Memory and oral tradition. Without written language, everything was memorized and stored with exacting precision. This resulted in deep historical and strategic intelligence, passed down across generations without dilution. The modern world has obscured these traits, but they are not lost. They are dormant. The supremacy of the wild man is not a relic of the past. It is a potential that still exists, waiting to be reawakened. Forged by adversity, epigenetics, neuroplasticity, and the reawakening of strength. The wild man is not merely a product of his environment. He is shaped by it at a molecular level. His body does not passively experience the trials of the world. It adapts, encodes, and evolves in response to them. This is the essence of epigenetics, the biological mechanism through which external forces activate or deactivate genes, sculpting an organism's physiology, psychology, and resilience in real time. Unlike the deterministic view of genetics that once dominated science, where DNA was seen as an unchanging script, epigenetics reveal a far more dynamic reality. Genes are not static blueprints, but a vast motherboard of potential, with thousands of on-off switches that are triggered by environmental conditions, stressors, and lived experiences. Every hardship a man endures leaves a trace within him, not just as a memory, but as a biomechanical signature embedded in his very cells. These are molecular imprints, known as epigenetic markers, and they determine which genetic instructions are expressed and which will remain dormant. The wild man's ancestry, forged by fire, famine, and battle, did not merely survive their ordeals. They inscribed their resilience into their genetic code, passing it down through the generations. The modern man, by contrast, lives in an age where hardship has been systematically eradicated, an environment so sterilized and predictable that his body receives no signal to activate the latent strength encoded in his DNA. The mechanisms of adaptation: stress, trial, and transformation. The science of epigenetics provides a profound insight into how the wild man is shaped, not just by individual experiences, but by the accumulated trials of his lineage. Every challenge he faces, every environment he endures, sends a biochemical signal to his body, commanding it to change. This transformation does not occur at the level of conscious effort alone. It is embedded into his genetic architecture. Epigenetic markers unlocking dormant survival mechanisms. The wild man is not born with all his strengths fully realized. They are activated through exposure to controlled adversity. Prolonged exposure to extreme conditions, whether physical, environmental, or psychological, alters the epigenome, the regulatory layer that determines which genes are switched on or off. For example, cold exposure stimulates the activation of brown adipose tissue, increasing metabolic efficiency and thermoregulation, mirroring the adaptations of early humans who thrived in Ice Age conditions. Prolonged fasting triggers autophagy, a cellular repair process that eliminates weak cells and strengthens the body at the foundational level, akin to the fasting cycles endured by hunter-gatherers who experienced food scarcity. Combat and high-intensity struggle elevate epinephrine and testosterone levels, reinforcing aggression pathways and enhancing muscular resilience, an echo of the warrior traditions that shaped mankind's most dominant lineages. The modern world has stripped these triggers from daily life. The abundance of comfort, food, and climate control has deactivated many of the genes that once gave the wild man his power. Yet these adaptations are not lost, only dormant, waiting for the right signals to awaken them once more. Neuroplasticity and the training of the nervous system. Just as epigenetics transforms the body, neuroplasticity reshapes the mind. The nervous system is not a fixed entity. It is a living, malleable structure that constantly rewires itself in response to stimulus, repetition, and challenge. The wild man's brain is fundamentally different from the modern man's, not because of genetics alone, but because of the brutal conditioning it undergoes. In a world without safety nets, survival required an unparalleled capacity for reaction, calculation, and adaptation. This was not something learned in a classroom, but ingrained through continuous trial and immediate consequences. Every moment of hardship strengthened the wild man's neurological pathways, forming an organism that could, number one, react instantly to threats with hyper-attuned reflexes developed through direct combat, hunting, and navigating unpredictable environments. Number two, enter deep, trance-like states of flow during battle or endurance hunts, where the prefrontal cortex quiets and the body moves with instinctive precision. And number three, suppress pain and override discomfort through an enhanced endogenous opioid system, reducing the perception of suffering and allowing for prolonged exertion beyond normal thresholds. The modern nervous system, by contrast, has been conditioned for fragility. The absence of real struggle has left it hypersensitive to stressors, making even trivial discomfort seem insurmountable. The man who spends his days indoors, glued to screens, is rewiring his nervous system just as surely as the wild man did, but in the opposite direction. Instead of reinforcing strength, endurance, and discipline, he is programming his body for weakness, inaction, and overstimulation. Yet just as the nervous system can be dulled, it can be sharpened once more. Generational trauma and the legacy of hardship. What a man endures does not end with him. It echoes forward. Epigenetic markers do not simply vanish at death. They are passed to offspring, encoding the experiences of prior generations into the biological fabric of the next. This is why certain populations whose ancestors faced extreme survival conditions often exhibit remarkable resilience in their descendants. Consider the physiological advantages inherited from ancestral hardships. The Sherpa people of Nepal, direct descendants of the high-altitude adapted Denisovans, possess unique oxygen processing genes that allow them to thrive in environments that would debilitate most humans. The descendants of African slaves, whose ancestors endured starvation and brutality, exhibit metabolic adaptations that enhance energy efficiency and physical endurance, traits that persist in elite athletes today. And the grandsons of World War survivors often exhibit heightened stress resilience and a predisposition for hypervigilance, a biological imprint of the wartime hardships faced by their forebears. But just as resilience can be inherited, so too can weakness. Modern generations, coddled by the age of excess, are beginning to pass down fragility, altering the epigenetic landscape in a way that favors slower metabolic rates, increased anxiety responses, and diminished physical resilience. The legacy of hardship is fading, replaced by the legacy of comfort. Reclaiming the genetic strength of the wild man. The wild man does not accept the fate of generational decline. He understands that his epigenetic inheritance is a weapon waiting to be reforged. Every hardship he undergoes today is not just for himself. It is a reactivation of a lineage that stretches back to the dawn of mankind. His trials are not merely for his own transformation. They are an act of defiance against the creeping decay of modernity. He awakens what lies dormant, rewires what has gone soft, and inscribes power to the bloodline once more. Through calculated suffering, exposure to extremes, and the deliberate rejection of comfort, the wild man reclaims his biological sovereignty. He ceases to be a product of his environment and becomes the architect of his own evolution. His body is not merely a reflection of his actions, it is a manifestation of his will. The irreversible nature of transformation. Once the wild man awakens, there is no turning back. The moment he steps into discomfort and willingly embraces suffering as his teacher, his body and mind begin an irreversible metamorphosis. He no longer seeks to escape hardship. He hungers for it, knowing that each trial is another strike of the hammer upon the steel of his being. A man who has walked through fire cannot be burned again in the same way. The nervous system adapts, the mind evolves, and the body strengthens to meet the demands placed upon it. What was once an unbearable burden becomes fuel. What was once a breaking point becomes a threshold to new power. The wild man does not retreat. He transforms, adapts, and ascends. Comfort is the enemy of evolution, and once a man has felt the raw power of deliberate suffering, he will never return to complacency. He has seen what lies beyond the illusion of modernity. He has touched the primal force that shaped his ancestors. He has stood at the edge of his limits and demanded more. Part 2. The Fall of the Wild Man. Why he was broken. The Agricultural Revolution. The beginning of weakness. The wild man did not fall in battle. He was not conquered by a greater force, nor brought to his knees by an enemy worthy of his strength. He was broken by slow decay, by a system that traded power for predictability, freedom for submission, and raw, unfiltered vitality for comfort. This was the agricultural revolution, the beginning of the end. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans thrived as apex predators, consuming nutrient-dense diets rich in meat, organs, marrow, fat, and seasonal plants and fruits. They moved constantly, engaged in rigorous physical exertion, and honed their bodies into instruments of endurance, strength, and lethal precision. Then came farming. How farming destroyed the wild man's diet, strength, and spirit. Agriculture introduced grain-based diets, reducing the protein and fat intake that fueled the wild man's superior musculature and endurance. Archaeological evidence shows that post-agricultural humans suffered from malnutrition, stunted growth, and increased disease rates due to nutrient deficiencies. The reliance on a few staple crops made populations vulnerable to famine, whereas hunter-gatherers thrived on a diverse and adaptable diet. With the rise of settlements, food surpluses led to social hierarchies. For the first time, the strongest man was not necessarily the one in control, but rather the one who controlled the grain. Sedentary civilization, the ruin of testosterone, mental fortitude, and autonomy. The wild man's body was adapted for constant motion, running, hunting, fighting. The shift to static agricultural labor eroded the necessity for peak physical condition. Bones became thinner, muscles atrophied, and metabolic efficiency declined. Testosterone levels, once maximized by high-protein diets, constant exertion, and intense competition, began to drop. Modern studies show that testosterone levels in men have been steadily declining for generations, a trend that began with the shift away from the wild man's lifestyle. Hardship once forged resilience. The wild man faced the elements, predators, and warfare, but civilization insulated him from struggle, weakening his mind along with his body. Fear of pain replaced the ability to endure it. The rise of mass control, taxation, and dependence on rulers. The wild man was autonomous. His survival was based on his own skill, not the dictates of a ruling class. Farming changed this. Land ownership, taxation, and structured economies created the first permanent class hierarchies, where rulers extracted wealth from laborers. A once self-sufficient people became dependent on systems, grain storage, trade networks, rulers who decided who could eat and who would starve. The warrior hunter was now a peasant, his strength meaningless in a world of laws and quotas. The shift from personal sovereignty to state control marked the end of the wild man's supremacy. Governments and institutions began managing human lives, controlling resources, and enforcing obedience. This was not just a physical change, it was the beginning of a spiritual domestication. The agricultural revolution was not a triumph. It was a slow collapse into mediocrity. It did not make men stronger, wiser, or more resilient. It made them weaker, dependent, and afraid. And so the first chains were forged, binding the wild man to a future of servitude. The industrial and technological revolutions, the final slavery. The wild man's decline did not end with agriculture. Though the plow had weakened his body, industry and technology would sever his spirit completely. Where the farmer was still connected to the land, albeit in servitude, the modern man became something altogether different. A captive of machines, a creature caged by convenience, a being wholly removed from the forces that once made him strong. How modern life infantilized men and stripped them of self-sufficiency. Machines replaced manual labor, eroding the necessity of strength and endurance. No longer did a man need to build, carry, or fight for survival. Machines did the work, and in doing so, stole the purpose of the body. The cities grew, and with them, the walls separating men from nature. Houses became boxes, streets became prisons, and the connection to the wild was severed. The modern diet of processed grains, refined sugars, and artificial fats further distanced man from his primal fuel, dampening his hormonal balance and metabolic efficiency. Dependency replaced autonomy. Where the wild man once took what he needed, the modern man buys, leases, and begs. His survival is dictated by an invisible hand that supplies or withholds. Dopamine addiction, fear of suffering, and the death of hardship. The wild man was hardened by hunger, battle, and the elements. The modern man is softened by screens, instant gratification, and the absence of real struggle. Dopamine cycles enslave him. Social media, pornography, entertainment, and hyper-processed foods hijack his brain's reward system, making him a slave to synthetic pleasures. Without exposure to comfort, his nervous system becomes fragile. The fear of pain replaces the ability to endure it, creating a man incapable of true resilience. The illusion of strength, artificial athletes, empty fitness, and the lost warrior ethos. The modern athlete may be larger, faster, and more chemically enhanced, but he is not the same breed as the wild man. Gym cultures create bodies for aesthetics, not function. The wild man did not train for vanity. His strength was a necessity, honed through battle, survival, and primal movement. Even the strongest modern men lack true autonomy. The wild man's power was freedom itself, strength that served no master, endurance that answered to no clock, resilience that existed outside of a gym's walls. The final chains, a life managed by institutions. Governments, corporations, and technology have reduced man to a passive consumer, reliant on systems beyond his control. The wild man was once the apex force of his environment. Now the modern man is shaped by algorithms, conditioned by bureaucracy, and dependent on a fragile supply chain. Where he once was sovereign, he is now owned. His mind is dictated by screens, his body is softened by comfort, and his spirit is caged by a world that no longer demands his strength. The industrial and technological revolutions were not progress. They were the final stage of captivity. The wild man has been tamed, but he is not extinct. His blood still remembers, and the call of the untamed world still echoes in the hearts of those willing to listen. The hidden remnants, who still carries the wild man's blood? Though the wild man has largely been tamed by civilization, his spirit has not been extinguished. Every human being carries the latent potential of their primal ancestors, but modernity has suppressed it beneath layers of comfort, ease, and artificiality. However, there are peoples and regions where this suppression has been weaker, where hardship, survival, labor, and connection to the land have kept the embers of the wild man burning. These groups serve as proof that the primal strength of man is not gone. It is merely waiting to be reawakened. Which modern ethnicities and tribes still retain wild man genetics? Georgians and Dagestanis. In the rugged Caucasus Mountains, where war and hardship have been constants for centuries, men are still forged by necessity. Wrestling is a way of life, endurance is non-negotiable, and their bodies are built through combat and survival rather than artificial training. Strength athletes, wrestlers, and combat sports champions from this region continue to showcase their raw power and resilience. Samoans and Pacific Islanders. Descendants of the great Polynesian navigators, these people traversed the largest ocean on the planet using only their strength, endurance, and understanding of the natural world. Their massive bone density, unparalleled explosive strength, and natural athleticism are direct carryovers from their seafaring warrior lineage. Rugby players, strongmen, and combat sports athletes from these regions remain among the world's most dominant. Mongols, the descendants of Genghis Khan's horsemen. Mongols have retained their raw resilience through a culture that still values horsemanship, archery, and survival in harsh, open landscapes. Their ability to endure extreme weather, sustain themselves on minimal food, and function in battle conditions for extended periods is a testament to their preserved wild man attributes. Even today, Mongolian wrestlers and endurance athletes prove the resilience of their lineage. Icelanders and Norse descendants. Harsh winters, volcanic landscapes, and the historical influence of Viking blood have kept Icelandic and Scandinavian men amongst the strongest in the world. Despite their diminutive population, strongman champions, powerlifters, soccer players, and endurance athletes from these regions continue to prove that their bodies are still built for war and survival. West Central Africans. These populations display extraordinary muscle density, explosive power, and natural endurance, traits shaped by generations of labor-intensive survival. Sprinters, fighters, and power-based athletes from this region remain among the most physically dominant in the world. Slavs. The extreme cold and harsh environments and austere way of life in Siberia and Eastern Europe have preserved some of the most powerful men in history. Their thick bone density, high pain tolerance, and raw power output are testaments to their hardiness. Weightlifters, combat sport athletes, and endurance competitors from these regions continue to demonstrate wild man resilience. Resilience outside of urbanization. Beyond ethnicity or geography, robust and resilient people can be found in all countries, especially outside of urban centers, and especially those raised on farms or in labor-intensive environments, proving the potential still lies in all modern man. The demands of daily physical work, exposure to nature, and the absence of modern sedentary conveniences create men whose bodies and minds remain closer to the wild man's original form. Across the world on all continents, those who grew up in rural landscapes, shepherding, hunting, and building with their own hands, often display superior strength, endurance, and adaptability compared to their urbanized counterparts. Can the wild man be reborn? The answer is not found in geography, but in mindset. Every man, regardless of origin, carries the code of the wild man in his blood. It has not been erased, only buried beneath generations of comfort and submission. The men of the Caucasus, the Pacific Islands, the Mongolian steppes, West Central Africa, Eastern Europe, and the Nordic frontiers are not superior. They have simply been forced to remain close to the edge, to retain the traits that once defined us all. The wild man can return anywhere, in anyone. It is not about where you are from. It is about whether you are willing to reclaim what is being lost. The blueprint for raw strength, endurance, and mental resilience exists in every man who has the courage to listen to it. The wild man is not a relic of the past. He is the future for those who refuse to kneel. Part 3, the resurrection, reclaiming the wild man. The rituals and rites of passages that built the wild man. The wild man was never simply born, he was forged. The transition from boy to man, from man to warrior, was never left to chance. In every warrior society, in every untamed land where strength and survival were paramount, rites of passage separated the weak from the strong, the untested from the proven. Without them, the wild man does not exist. Modern civilization has abolished these trials, replacing them with institutional milestones and empty celebrations that do not demand sacrifice, hardship, or earned transformation. But the knowledge of these rituals remains, and their lessons can be applied to reclaim the path of the wild man. Why rites of passage were essential? They created threshold experiences, forcing young men to face mortality, fear, and suffering. They restructured the mind, proving that pain, endurance, and resilience could be wielded like weapons. They fostered spiritual awakening, forging an unbreakable connection between the man, the land, and the unseen forces of nature. They established a code of honor and purpose, ensuring that every man knew his worth and duty within his tribe. Examples of wild man rites of passage across cultures. The Spartan agoge, a brutal system designed to strip weakness from boys, turning them into warriors through deprivation, combat, and survival training. They learned pain tolerance, strategic warfare, and brotherhood through hardship. The Norse Viking trial. Young Norsemen proved themselves through deadly sea voyages, single combat, or surviving alone in the wilderness. Their trial was simple: endure, conquer, or perish. The Mongolian horseman initiation. From childhood, Mongols were expected to master horseback combat, endure brutal winters, and hunt with precision. They were trained to survive with minimal resources, fight as a unit, and dominate the open steppe. The Maasai lion hunt. Young Maasai warriors once had to kill a lion with nothing but a spear to prove their strength and courage. This trial ensured that only the most fearless became warriors, embodying the raw ferocity of nature. The Aboriginal walkabout, a solitary journey into the wild that lasted for months, forcing young men to rely on their instincts, survival skills, and spiritual resilience. They returned as men who had conquered isolation, hunger, and the elements. The bullet ant ritual, a test of sheer pain endurance. This Amazonian rite involves boys wearing gloves filled with bullet ants, whose sting is among the most excruciating on Earth. They must endure the stings without showing weakness, proving their ability to withstand suffering and emerge as warriors. The Thaipusam Kavadi ritual. Practiced by Tamil Hindus, this rite involves impaling the body with hooks, spears, or skewers while carrying heavy burdens in a pilgrimage of devotion. Many participants enter a trance-like state, demonstrating control over physical suffering through spiritual will. The hook suspension ritual, veneration of the spirits. Found among some African and South Asian cultures, this extreme test of pain tolerance involves suspending oneself from hooks pierced through the flesh, often while being spun or swung in circles. This ritual serves as both a spiritual offering and a demonstration of a warrior's ability to transcend agony. The Mandan Okipa ceremony. Practiced by the Mandan tribe of North America, this harrowing initiation required young men to endure days of fasting, followed by suspension from wooden stakes driven through their chest muscles. They were then spun in circles, their bodies tested to the brink of collapse, proving their dedication to their people and their ability to conquer suffering. The death of modern rites and why they must return. The modern world has stripped men of these trials, replacing them with meaningless rituals devoid of true struggle. Graduation ceremonies, corporate promotions, and digital achievements offer no suffering, no earned transformation, only shallow markers of existence. To reclaim the wild man, men must create their own trials. Whether through grueling physical hardship, voluntary isolation, combat training, or exposure to extreme elements, a new generation of wild men must be forged through pain, endurance, and earned strength. The world does not need more passive participants. It needs men who have conquered themselves, who have walked through fire and emerged untamed. The wild man is not given, he is earned. The wild man's esoteric power, more than just strength. The wild man is not only a being of raw physical dominance, he is something far greater. His strength is not confined to muscle, speed, or endurance, but extends into the realm of sovereignty, perception, and alignment with the forces of nature and the unseen. Civilization has sought to strip him of this connection, reducing man to a mechanized laborer and predictable consumer, a creature bound by rules written by weaker men. But within those who still seek it, the esoteric power of the wild man remains intact, waiting to be rekindled. Sovereignty and the transparent eyeball. The wild man does not look at the world through the lens of fear, nor does he rely on external validation. His perspective is clear, unfiltered, and fully present. Unlike the modern man, who moves through life with a mind cluttered by artificial narratives, the wild man perceives the world as it truly is. He does not seek refuge in illusions of security or societal constructs of identity. His only truth is direct experience. The transparent eyeball, a concept from transcendentalist philosophy, is the ability to see reality as it truly is, not as society dictates. The wild man does not merely observe, he integrates seamlessly as he perceives. He sees the world's patterns, its hidden truths, its cycles of power and decay, and aligns himself accordingly. There is no disconnect between what is and what should be. Where the modern man is fragmented, divided between the self he presents and the self he suppresses, the wild man is whole. He moves with the tides of existence rather than resisting them, instinctively recognizing the ebb and flow of forces greater than himself. The ability to perceive without distortion is what makes the wild man sovereign. His reality is not dictated by politics, religion, or mass hysteria. He knows that all of these are merely attempts by lesser men to impose structure on what is inherently untamed. He sees through the falsehoods that blind the modern world. The illusion of perpetual safety, the artificial importance of status, the meaningless distractions that occupy the minds of the domesticated. To the wild man, freedom does not come from rebellion. It comes from absolute clarity. Unlike the modern man who is shackled by illusion of security, of identity, and a false sense of control, the wild man understands that to truly see is to be free. He does not resist reality or attempt to alter it to fit his expectations. Instead, he moves through it with precision, mirroring a predator in the wild. He wastes no energy on false hopes, nor does he succumb to existential confusion. He is not a slave to ideology or comfort. He exists as he is, neither seeking validation nor fearing isolation. This clarity grants him a kind of invisibility in a world ruled by delusion. He does not stand out by force, but by absence. He is neither a part of the machine nor its victim. He does not rage against the system. He simply does not belong to it. This is his greatest weapon, a mind unclouded, a will unshackled, a spirit untamed. Living proof, men who embodied the wild man. The wild man has never fully vanished. Throughout history, there have been individuals who embodied his raw power, his autonomy, and his indomitable will. These men did not conform to the rules of civilization. They lived outside it, carved their own paths, and left legacies of unshakable resilience. Orrin Porter Rockwell, the gunfighter saint. Orrin Porter Rockwell was a living paradox, a man of faith who carried death on his hip. Known as the destroying angel of Mormonism, Rockwell was a lawman, a tracker, and a warrior, an executioner who served none but his own principles. He was feared and revered in equal measure, a frontier legend who embodied the raw essence of the wild man. His reputation was so legendary that John Wayne would later say Porter Rockwell was the toughest man in the West. He could shoot faster and ride harder than any man alive. John Wayne also used Rockwell's motto, "I never killed anyone who didn't need killing." A warrior without fear, Rockwell engaged in over 150 gunfights, emerging unscathed not by luck, but by sheer instinct, precision, and an almost supernatural ability to sense danger before it arrived. His legend claimed that no bullet could kill him so long as he never cut his hair, a belief that carried as both superstition and defiance. A man of unbreakable will, when falsely imprisoned for nearly a year without trial, he survived in a freezing cell on near-starvation rations. Upon release, he was gaunt and withered, but rode a stolen mule across hundreds of miles of wilderness to return to his people. He endured thirst, exhaustion, and the elements with sheer force of will, never allowing the soft hand of civilization to break him. A living wild man, Rockwell was described as a paradox of nature, a man both brutal and loyal, simple yet deadly. A contemporary once wrote, "He was that most terrible instrument that can be handled by fanaticism, a powerful physical nature welded to a mind of very narrow perceptions, intense convictions, and changeless tenacity. In his build, he was a gladiator. In his humor, a Yankee lumberman. In his memory, a Bourbon. In his vengeance, an Indian. A strange mixture only to be found on the American continent." A code of honor rooted in violence and virtue. Despite his reputation as a killer, Rockwell did not kill indiscriminately. He operated by a brutal but consistent personal code. He was loyal to those he swore to protect, merciless to those who threatened him, and indifferent to the judgment of the weak. He was no mere gunslinger. He was a force of nature. He did not seek permission to live as he chose. He carved out his place in the world by sheer force, with a rifle in one hand and an unshakable will in the other. Civilization could never tame him, and history could never forget him. Sir Richard Francis Burton, the savage scholar. If Rockwell was the warrior of the frontier, Sir Richard Francis Burton was the philosopher king of the untamed world. A man who could fight with his sword as skillfully as he wrote with his pen, Burton was an explorer, soldier, linguist, and master of disguise. Where Rockwell embodied the wild man's raw force, Burton was its intellectual equal, fierce, relentless, and entirely untamed in both body and mind. Burton and Rockwell met in the American West, two wild men standing at the edges of civilization. Burton, ever the observer, was fascinated by Rockwell's primal instincts, while Rockwell recognized in Burton the same defiant refusal to be caged. Despite their vastly different backgrounds, they were cut from the same cloth. Men who could not be tamed, only understood by those of their kind. A mind as dangerous as his body, Burton was fluent in over 29 languages and 11 dialects, making him one of the most formidable intellectuals of the time. He used this ability not for academic vanity, but to infiltrate, understand, and conquer the unknown. A warrior scholar in its truest sense. Unlike most explorers, Burton was no frail academic in need of protection. He was a swordsman of legendary skill, having fought and won countless duels. His combat prowess saved his life when, during an expedition in Somalia, he was ambushed and took a spear through the face. Yet he fought his way out, surviving with an unshaken will. A man who defied all boundaries. He was one of the first non-Muslims to enter Mecca disguised as a pilgrim with the help of his mastery of the Arabic language. Risking death to uncover the secrets of the holy city, he mapped forbidden lands, lived among tribes considered hostile, and explored cultures that would have swallowed lesser men whole. Where others feared the unknown, Burton sought it out. A challenger of empires, Burton had no allegiance to the British aristocracy that birthed him. He despised colonial arrogance and sought to understand foreign peoples rather than rule over them. His writings were not mere observations. They were immersions into the raw, unfiltered life of warriors, mystics, and nomads. A true embodiment of the wild man's contradiction. He could navigate a royal court as easily as he could a pirate den, yet he was a man of learning, yet despised academia's sterilization of knowledge, and he held the strength of a warrior while carrying the curiosity of a mystic. His presence was both feared and admired in every culture he entered. Like Rockwell, Burton existed outside the boundaries of control. He refused to be labeled, categorized, or bound by the rules of civilization. He did not just study the wild man, he became him. His legacy was not one of conquest, but of understanding, endurance, and the absolute refusal to let civilization cage his mind or body. Liver-eating Johnson, the mountain titan. If Rockwell was the warrior and Burton the scholar, then liver-eating Johnson was the embodiment of pure, unrelenting survival. A towering mountain man who roamed the American frontier in the 19th century, Johnson was a man of mythic proportions, a hunter, a trapper, a warrior, and a relentless force of vengeance. His legend was born in blood and sustained by an unbreakable will. A vengeance-fueled force of nature. After a Crow warrior killed his flathead wife, Johnson embarked on a 25-year vendetta, systematically hunting and killing Crow warriors, reportedly cutting out and eating their livers as an act of psychological warfare. Whether myth or reality, the sheer endurance of his campaign speaks to his unparalleled resolve and ruthlessness. A man unbroken by nature. Unlike others who depend on settlements for survival, Johnson thrived in complete isolation. He survived brutal winters in the Rockies, fought off grizzly bears with nothing but a knife, and endured wounds that would have felled lesser men. His ability to hunt, trap, and fight in the wilderness made him nearly untouchable. A physical titan, Johnson was said to be over 6 feet tall and nearly 260 pounds of raw muscle, built entirely from a life of hardship. He could crush a man's skull with his bare hands and routinely fought multiple opponents at once, emerging victorious. A warrior's mind in a primal body. Though he was a man of brute force, Johnson was not a mindless killer. He understood the psychology of his enemies, using fear as a weapon just as much as his rifle or tomahawk. He mastered the art of guerrilla warfare long before modern military doctrine recognized its value. A living nightmare to his enemies, an unbreakable legend to his peers. Though many wild men faded into history, Johnson's legend endured, solidified by books, films, and oral tradition. He was the archetype of the lone warrior, the man who answered to no one and forged his destiny through raw willpower and an indomitable spirit. John Liver-Eating Johnson was not just a man, he was a force of nature. Where others needed society to shape them, he shaped himself against the wild, against his enemies, and against the elements. He did not bow, did not break, and did not wait for permission to exist. His legacy is that of the ultimate survivor, the man who proved that in the absence of civilization, the true measure of strength is revealed. Albert Johnson, the mad trapper of Rat River. Few men have ever embodied the raw, untamed chaos of the wild man like Albert Johnson, the mad trapper of Rat River. A ghost-like figure of the Canadian wilderness, Johnson defied all known limits of human endurance, evading capture for weeks against overwhelming odds, outpacing entire search parties, and leaving a legacy of mystery and sheer physical supremacy. A phantom in the Arctic wild. Johnson arrived in the Yukon under unknown circumstances, living in total isolation, defying the RCMP, or the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, when they attempted to question him. He built a remote cabin and thrived in conditions that would kill most men in days. A manhunt like no other. After a conflict with authorities, Johnson led one of the most legendary manhunts in history, evading dog teams, aircraft, and elite trackers in -40 conditions for over a month, traveling at speeds that should have been impossible in deep snow. Superhuman endurance. When finally engaged in battle, Johnson took multiple gunshot wounds, including one that shattered his pelvis, yet continued to fight and evade, pushing beyond any conceivable limit of human survival. An indomitable will. Even when cornered, he refused to surrender. He fought to his last breath, proving that no institution, no force of law, and no mortal enemy could break his spirit. A mystery that endures. To this day, no one knows Johnson's true identity. He carried no identification, spoke little, and left no trace of his past. His story is a testament to the idea that the wild man does not belong to a civilization. He simply exists beyond it. Albert Johnson was more than a fugitive. He was a testament to man's ability to reject control, survive against impossible odds, and carve his legend into the harshest landscape on Earth. His story, like that of all true wild men, is not one of crime or lawlessness, but a force too great to be contained by the hands of weaker men. The frontiersmen, lords of the unclaimed land. Before manifest destiny swept across the continent, before railroads cut through mountains and settlers fenced the wilderness, there were men who roamed where no law extended. They were not conquerors, not settlers, not soldiers. They were frontiersmen, warriors of the land who mastered survival in its most brutal form. Jim Bridger, Jedediah Smith, and Tom Fitzpatrick were among the greatest of them. They did not seek to rule or tame the land. They only sought to exist within its untamed beings. Jedediah Smith, the West's first savage explorer. Jedediah Smith was a man who did not recognize limits. He was one of the first white men to push deep into the unknown, to cross into the vast and perilous Great Basin, and to survive where others perished. He was not driven by conquest or settlement, but by a compulsion to go where no men had gone before. He was scalped by a grizzly bear, sewed his own head back together, and kept moving. His ear was nearly torn off in the attack, yet he forced his men to stitch it back together on his head while he gave them instructions. He traveled thousands of miles on foot and horseback, mapping vast sections of the West. He was the first known American to cross into California from the east and survive the unforgiving Mojave Desert. He fought off native ambushes, starvation, and disease, yet never backed down from an expedition. He lived as an outsider, never settling, always pushing further. Smith did not seek the comforts of society. His home was the wilderness. Jim Bridger, the ultimate pathfinder. If Smith was the explorer, Bridger was the master of the land itself. He was more than just a survivor. He became one with the landscape. Bridger could read the earth like a book, predicting weather, tracking enemies, and finding safe passage through impassable terrain. He spoke multiple native languages and understood the land better than any man of his time. He spent years alone in the wilderness, living entirely off the land. Bridger was the definition of self-sufficiency, able to disappear into the wild for months at a time. He learned and respected native customs, often living amongst different tribes. He spoke Sioux, Crow, and several other indigenous tongues fluently. Fought off countless ambushes and attacks, yet never sought unnecessary bloodshed. He was feared and respected in equal measure. His knowledge was eventually used by the US government to guide settlers, but he himself remained untamed. Unlike the settlers that followed, Bridger did not seek to claim the land. He only sought to navigate and understand it. Tom Fitzpatrick, the other liver-eating Johnson. While Johnson's legend looms large, Tom Fitzpatrick was just as unbreakable. He was the ultimate survivalist, able to vanish into the wilderness and thrive where others would die. He once crossed the Great Plains alone, surviving on raw buffalo and pure willpower. After being separated from his party in the dead of winter, Fitzpatrick endured weeks of isolation, hunting only what he could kill and often eating raw meat to avoid detection. With no shelter, no fire, and only his rifle, he walked hundreds of miles back to safety, proving his ability to survive under the harshest conditions. He escaped capture multiple times from hostile tribes, using only his wits and endurance. On at least 2 occasions, Fitzpatrick was taken prisoner by native warriors. He escaped both times by waiting for the cover of night, sneaking past guards, and traversing brutal terrain on foot, sometimes without food or water for days. He had near mythic reputation as a man who could not be caught, killed, or broken. Rival tribes and bounty hunters alike sought him, but Fitzpatrick's ability to navigate terrain, evade pursuit, and endure extreme hardship made him a ghost among men. He was feared and respected by both settlers and warriors alike, known for his unmatched ability to disappear into the land. Whether he was scouting new territory or escaping capture, Fitzpatrick had an instinctual mastery over the wild, disappearing into its vastness as though it was his own domain. The frontier was their kingdom and their grave. Smith, Bridger, and Fitzpatrick were not settlers. They were not manifest destiny's soldiers. They were the vanguard of the wild man's last great age, where men could roam, live, and die on their own terms. Their knowledge of the land was eventually exploited by expansionists, but they themselves never sought to own, dominate, or subdue the land. Unlike the farmers and railroad barons who followed in their wake, these men did not build fences. They did not carve in the land into parcels. They moved as the wind moved, unburdened, unchained, and untamed. Their time came and went, swallowed by the inevitable march of civilization, but their spirits remain the testament to who man once was, and who he can be again. The path forward, how to become the wild man again. The modern world has done everything in its power to sever the man from his original state. It has conditioned him to be weak, dependent, and disconnected from the forces that once shaped his ancestors into beings of unmatched resilience. But the wild man has not vanished. His essence lies dormant in every man willing to reclaim what was lost. The path forward is not easy, nor should it be. It is a process of destruction and rebirth, of unlearning the comforts of civilization and forging the self anew. What modern men must do to break free from weakness. Reclaiming the wild man is not simply about training the body. It is about reconfiguring the mind and spirit. Civilization has taught men to fear suffering, to avoid discomfort, and to submit to external control. To escape this fate, a complete rewilding must occur. Voluntary hardship. Hardship must be embraced, not avoided. Cold exposure, fasting, brutal physical exertion, rites of passages, and minimalism all retain the nervous system to thrive under stress rather than collapse under it. Discomfort must be a teacher rather than the enemy. Autonomy over body and mind. The wild man is sovereign over himself. This means complete control over one's habits, thoughts, and reactions. Dependency on stimulants, distractions, and external validation must be eradicated. The modern world breeds men who react emotionally rather than act with calculated intent. The wild man moves with purpose. Mastery over physicality. A strong body is non-negotiable. Strength, endurance, flexibility, and durability must be cultivated simultaneously. Unlike modern fitness programs, which are fragmented into aesthetics or single discipline performance, the wild man trains for functionality and survival, lifting heavy natural objects outside, running far, enduring pain, and staying adaptable to any environment. Living by the code of the wild. The wild man does not conform to society's expectations. He builds his own guiding principles. He does not seek permission. He simply acts. He does not need external validation. He knows his worth. He does not operate in fear. He moves with precision and purpose. Part 4, the conclusion. The wild man endures. The wild man has never been a myth. He was real, stronger, faster, and more resilient than the men of today. His world was one of raw survival, where mastery over body, mind, and nature determined who thrived and who perished. And though civilization has sought to bury him, to replace him with comfort, dependence, and submission, his legacy still lingers in the blood of those who refuse to be tamed. The proof of his strength, the tools he left behind. If modern man wishes to understand their ancestors, they need only look at what they were capable of. The remnants of their weapons, their feats, and their endurance reveal a level of power few today can even comprehend. The longbows of the Mary Rose. Discovered on Henry VIII's sunken warship, these bows had an estimated draw weight of 100 to 180 pounds, so immense that modern archers cannot draw them. The men who wielded them trained from childhood, developing bone structures so dense they remain visible in skeletal remains centuries later. The Mongol horse archers. Among the greatest warriors in history, Mongols fired their war bows while galloping at full speed, trained to release their arrows at the precise moment when all 4 of the horse's hooves were off the ground, for perfect accuracy. Their bows, often exceeding 160-pound draw weights, were short yet immensely powerful, built with layered sinew and horn, able to penetrate armor from over 300 yards away. The forgotten water warriors, the Patagons. The people of Patagonia, often mistaken for giants by early European explorers, were renowned for their sheer size and resilience. Able to endure freezing ocean waters with no protection, they lived in a world where hypothermia would claim modern men in minutes. They moved through harsh landscapes without the need for warmth or shelter, embodying the raw physical toughness of the wild man. What was lost, and can it be reclaimed? The fall of the wild man was not a failure of his body, but of the world that sought to make him obsolete. Civilization made him soft, lulled him into weakness with comforts, and stripped away the trials that once forged strength through suffering. Yet the wild man was never erased. He was simply buried beneath layers of modern excess. His strength, his endurance, his mind, these are not extinct. They are dormant, waiting in the blood of men who dare to wake them up. The tools to reclaim them have always been there. Exposure to the elements, the mastery of one's own body, the acceptance of pain and struggle as tools for transformation. The wild man is not gone. He is you. The men of today may live in a world of artificial lights and steel towers, but they are still descendants of warriors, hunters, and titans who once walked the earth unshackled. They may no longer need to wield 180-pound war bows or endure the frozen oceans, but the ability remains, the potential to return, to reclaim, to dominate one's own fate. The next question is not whether the wild man still exists. The question is whether he'll rise again. The choice is yours. A new breed of men the reclamation of strength, sovereignty, and will. For those who hear the call, the choice is clear. The world does not need more passive participants, more men who cower behind screens, waiting for permission to live. It needs beings of action, men who walk in the footsteps of their ancestors, who embrace hardship rather than flee from it, who carve their own path rather than follow another's. The wild man is not a relic of the past. He is the blueprint of what man was meant to be. The world may have tried to tame him, but for those who refuse to submit, they will find that the fire still burns within them. The path forward is one of hardship, but in hardship there is power. In suffering there is wisdom, and in the wild man there is freedom. The only question that remains is, will you reclaim it?